Good morning, church. Welcome to the Sunday after Easter. This is typically the lowest attendance that any church has during the year. So I'm glad you joined us. And most of the time, the Sunday after Easter, I find somebody else to preach because I don't want to preach to a half-empty room. But this week, like last week and for the last few weeks, I am preaching in a room with 4 individuals running sound or cameras. So unlike most Sundays after Easter, the crowd has not changed much. So I'm excited this morning as we continue our series, Hope in Crisis, and we're dealing with how to have hope, where to place hope, what God says about hope. And my goal for you this morning is that when you watch this, whether you're watching live or you watch it a few days later or you're listening online, I want you to know how to have hope when it doesn't feel good, when it hurts, when everything's falling apart. And so in a few minutes, we're going to read a story about an individual in the Old Testament who found himself in a hopeless situation. It was emotionally painful, it was difficult, but he held on to his hope. But before we jump into that story, I want to read some New and Old Testament passages and see what the Bible has to say about hope, about what we're to place our hope in, about why we trust in God, and about some things that we should not place our hope in. So let's jump into 1 Peter in verse 13 of chapter 1. He writes, "Therefore, preparing your minds for action. We are saved to do good works." We are saved for action. We aren't just saved and going on about our merry way. No, we are saved for action, and that action requires us to be sober-minded. We need to pay attention, know what's going on. We don't pretend that there aren't problems in the world. We don't pretend that everything is going as it should be. We know there is sin, there are problems, but we also set our hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. We know that our hope is not just a right now hope. It's a hope that looks forward to the future. It leads us to action. It helps us see the world as it really is. And then we see in Psalm chapter 62 that the word says, "Put no trust in extortion." Now, I know most of us are doing our best not to steal or lie or cheat, and so we know, no, we shouldn't do that. It says, "Set no vain hopes on robbery." Sure, we know that, but then it goes on to say, "If riches increase." So most of us are saying, yeah, we're not going to rob, we're not going to steal. But then he goes on to say, if riches increase, set not your heart on them. Over the last few weeks, many of us have found ourselves dealing with doubt, struggling with hope, because we are now finding ourselves insecure when it relates to riches, to our income, to our job security, to maybe the stock market or what we thought we had worth or value in. And he said, do not set your heart or your hope on money, on robbery, on those types of things. And then we see in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul is bragging on them as he writes letters. He would often remind them of how good their faith is and what their faith has led to and how their faith has transformed them. He says, "I remember before our God and Father your work of faith and labor of love." Faith and love that led to works and steadfastness of hope. We don't just have a hope that is there when times are good. We have a steadfastness of hope. This is what makes the believer understand what life is all about. I have hope in Jesus when everything's going good. I have hope in Jesus when everything is falling apart in our Lord Jesus Christ. We have a steadfast hope because of what our hope is in. Our hope is not in money. Our hope is not in robbery or stealing. Our hope is not in stuff. It's in Jesus. Then we see in 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul wrote it this way, "As for the rich in this present age," and most of us just said, hey, that's not me. I want to remind you that if you find yourself in the United States of America and you are above the poverty line in this country, then you are what most would consider wealthy in terms of the world. There are literally millions, hundreds of millions of people who would right now switch places with you. So before we say, oh, that's not me, I want us to consider for a second, this might be us. He says, don't be haughty or proud. Some of us take for granted that somehow we earned where we are. We had no choice or right when we'd be born. We didn't know who we'd be born to. We didn't know we had no control over the season that we were born in history, where we have a lot of things we take for granted. So he says, don't be proud. Also, not to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches. This is a message for another day. Too many of us are right now struggling with doubt, struggling with faith, wrestling with hope, because we have been placing our hope in the uncertainty of riches. When the stock market is always up and to the right, everybody knows how to trade and make money. When everything's going well, everybody seems to know what they're doing. But when we have a little uncertainty, suddenly we have to ask ourselves what we are placing our hope on. But he says, instead, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. So in both scenarios, there's stuff to enjoy, but in this scenario, God provides it. When I understand that by placing my hope in God, I'm not responsible, I'm trusting God. I am not the object of my hope, because here's the truth, I will let myself down, I will let you down, you will let yourself down, you will let others down. When our hope is in God, He richly provides us with everything to enjoy. It's so much easier to enjoy when we know that God is the source and He is also the object of our hope. And then we see in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23, Paul writes, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For He who promised is faithful. Do you know why we can have hope right now? Not because we know what's going on. I'll be blunt with you. As a pastor, I don't know what's going to happen next. I have no idea what to expect on a day-to-day basis with what we are currently going through. But I do know this. I know that the Lord is faithful. He has promised that He is faithful. He has promised and come through on His promise, whether we're talking about spiritual promises, like providing a Messiah, a Savior, like we celebrated last weekend, or if we're talking about physical promises, if we're talking about any kind of promise in the New or Old Testament, God fulfills His promises, whether they be prophecy from the Old Testament that was fulfilled in Christ, or prophecy that is still being fulfilled all around us on a day-to-day basis. God is faithful. So I want to transition from just talking about hope, and here's why. I don't want you to assume that pastors just saying, I need to have hope. I am saying that. I absolutely am saying that. But I am not saying this morning that it is wrong to mourn. I am not saying that we shouldn't take time to acknowledge the problem that we're living through and that we're going through. What I hope this morning is that we can see that hope can survive and thrive in the midst of a crisis, that hope can get us through even the most difficult of days, but not hope in riches, not hope in stuff, not even hope in ourselves or in others, a hope that is deeper, richer, and fuller than what most other people are placing their hope in. I've got news for you. Most of the world right now is placing their hope in just going back to the way things were. I am praying this morning that we do not just go back to the way things were. Because here's the truth about the way things were 6, 10, 12 weeks ago. There was famine, there was hurting, there was death, there was sickness. There was all kinds of issues on our planet, in our community, in our city, in our families, in our personal lives that we need to deal with. So I never hope that we just get back to the way things were. I am praying this morning that you have a deeper hope than just getting back to the way things were. Now, I know we want to get back to work. I know we want to get back to the certainty that we felt like we had, but I want to remind you that there has never been a season where we have been assured of anything. For most of our lives, we have fooled ourselves into thinking that tomorrow is promised, that everything will always go our way, that everything will always fall into place. And now, with a little bit of uncertainty, we wrestle with doubt, we wrestle with faith, we wrestle with hope. And so this morning, I want to read to you a story, actually a psalm written by David, King David. But I want to tell you a story about the psalm because it's very important that we understand where he was and what he was going through as he was dealing with the crisis around him and as he wrote this psalm. So I want to turn your attention to Psalm chapter 3 and talk to you about how to have hope when it hurts. Because King David is in a season of his life that is emotionally painful, it is physically dangerous, and it is draining him. And in that season, he writes a psalm, Psalm chapter 3. And I want to read verse 1 to you. And before verse 1, there's actually this little, in your Bible and mine, there's this little phrase. It says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. King David had run outside of the walls of Jerusalem because he was running for his life, not from an outside enemy, not from someone who wanted to kill him and come in from outside of Jerusalem, but from his son who wanted to take his throne and take his life. A little bit of backstory. Before this took place, Absalom was very wise, and he had been sowing seeds and really going behind his father, the king. He would wait outside the king's gate. And as people would come into the king's court, they would bring issues of justice. Some of them had lawsuits. Some of them had issues to be resolved. They needed to see the king about. And Absalom would get up early in the morning, go to the king's gate, and wait. And as people would enter in, he'd say, oh, hey, I've got bad news. It wasn't true, but he would tell them, King David doesn't have anybody that can talk to you. You're not important. You used to be important. He used to love God's people. He used to love the people of Israel. But King David, he's pretty self-centered now. He doesn't have time for the common people. If I were king, I would make time for you. I would love you. I would issue justice. I would make sure that your cause was defended. But I'm not the king. Maybe one day I'll be king. But until then, I'm so sorry. The king won't hear you. So King David and his court, they were literally waiting for people to come to them, and Absalom was meeting them ahead of time, cutting them off and saying, no, he doesn't want to see you. No, he doesn't want to talk to you. He doesn't like the common man. And he went so far as not only to stand in front of the king's court, he would travel around and go to villages and say, hey, my father, King David, he has refused to travel. He doesn't want to come see you. He thinks you're commoners. He thinks you're hillbillies out here in the middle of nowhere. He doesn't love you. He doesn't care for you. But man, if I was king, I would care about your village. I would defend your poor. I would stick up for you people. And so if there's ever a time that you hear that somebody is leading a revolution and his name is Absalom, hey, you join in the revolution with me. Let's get things back on track. And he was doing all of this right under his father's nose. He would go into his father and ask permission to take these trips and tell his father that he was going to do his father's business, but he was going and he was leading a revolution right under King David's nose. So one afternoon, King David got the word that Absalom was leading hundreds of men through the streets of Jerusalem, and he was coming to dethrone and kill his own father. And so David flees to Mount Olivet. Mount Olivet is where Jesus probably prayed. It's near Bethany. It's about 3 miles outside of Jerusalem, and it's only about 3,000 feet elevation, so it's not so high that you can't see. As a matter of fact, when you're on Mount Olivet, you can see all of the streets of Jerusalem. So David goes to Mount Olivet. He's far enough away where they can't catch him, but he's close enough he can see the revolution taking place. He can see his son usurping him and taking control of the kingdom and kicking him out of his own city. And it's from that place that King David wrote this psalm. And it's my hope this morning that you will find hope and peace in this psalm, these 8 verses that David penned during the most difficult, trying, and emotional season of his life. Now, David had a heads up. We don't always have that opportunity. This was something that God foretold and told him would happen. David was not perfect. He was a man after God's own heart, but he did murder Uriah after he'd had an affair with Uriah's wife. And God told him, he said, this will lead to consequences. We are forgiven of our sin. Every sin I've committed, God has forgiven me for, but often there are consequences to our sin. The people we've hurt, when we do things that affect us physically. And these consequences, King David was forewarned about. He was told that there would be an uprising from within his own family. But he loved Absalom. He loved him deeply. And Absalom was a great leader, and King David loved him and wanted him to become king, but at the same time, Absalom was prideful, arrogant. And in this season of his life, David wrote Psalm 3, verse 1. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. As he wrote these words, he could see Jerusalem. He could see the crowd swelling. He could see the very people who wanted him dead. He goes on in verse 2. Many are saying of my soul. Now, the first thing he said was true. There were a lot of people. But now he's going on and he's saying some things that aren't true. He says, I want you to hear, Lord, what people are saying. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah, David says, wait a minute. Meditate on this. Consider this. I want you to see what David's doing here, because David has done a couple of things that are important. Number one, David is willing to acknowledge the pain. I want you to know that the first step in finding hope in the middle of a crisis is to acknowledge that things are not great. I have talked to too many people who, for the last few weeks, have just decided they're not even going to acknowledge that this is hard. They're going to pretend that everything is fine, that this is not a problem, that we will get through this. And I want you to hear me. As Christians, it is okay for us to acknowledge when something hurts. It is okay for us to say that we are hurting, that hope is hard, that doubt is strong, that faith is difficult. And so it's important that we acknowledge the pain, but that's not all that he does. Notice he doesn't just acknowledge the pain, he recognizes what's true and what's false. He recognizes lies. As we go through a crisis, there will often be lies from the enemy. There will often be lies from within, lies that we know are not true. Little voices telling us we'll never get through this. We'll never make it out alive. Everything's gonna fall apart. God brought me this far just to embarrass me. God brought me this far just to let me down. And David recognizes these are lies. He says, many are saying about me that there isn't even salvation in the Lord. He knows that's not true, and he recognizes that there is pain, but there are also lies. There are things being said about him that are not true. There are things that even his own heart may be wondering, but he knows it's not true. This is very important if we're going to have hope in the middle of a crisis. We have to acknowledge the pain, and we need to acknowledge that sometimes there are lies in our own heart because it is wicked and deceitful, and sometimes it leads us astray. There are lies around us. There are always going to be people who want to use a crisis to make money, who want to use a crisis to create panic, who want to use a crisis to have a platform. So we have to get good at recognizing what is true and what is not. But that is not all he does. Too often this is what we do, right? We acknowledge the pain, we realize there's lies about us, and we just hurt, we cry, we mourn. That's not where he stops. He goes on to speak truth. And if we are going to have hope in the middle of a crisis, if we're going to have hope when it hurts, we have to get good at speaking truth. It is important for us to hear it. It is important for us to say it. It is important for us to write it down. And that's what David does. He speaks it. He writes it. He rehearses it. Most of these Psalms were written to be sung. He wanted this to be on his lips. He wanted this to be said over and over. I want you to hear me say this. Your soul needs to hear you say what is true. We're going to talk about what's true, and we're going to read what David says is true, but I want you to understand, it doesn't matter who you are, if you hear enough lies, and you acknowledge lots of pain in your life, but you don't hear truth, and you don't repeat truth, it won't be long until you start believing the lies, and you begin to be overwhelmed by the pain. So he doesn't just acknowledge the pain, recognize the lies, he speaks the truth. Let's see how he speaks it. Beginning in verse 3, he says, "But you, O Lord," everyone else is saying this, all those people are coming to get me, "but you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head." In a moment where everyone was coming to hurt him, he said, "God, you defend me. You protect me. And you're the glory and the lifter of my head. When everyone else wants me to be ashamed, you lift my head." He goes on to say in verse 4, "I cried. It's okay to cry. It is all right to mourn. I have spoken with leaders. I've spoken with adults. I've spoken with young leaders, old leaders, people all across our church. And there are a lot of people right now who just tell me, 'Pastor, I don't know why, but I just cry a lot.' I don't either. This is emotionally draining. It is difficult to not be around people. It is difficult to have your whole rhythm changed on you and everything that you thought you knew to now be uncertain. It is okay to cry." He says, "I cried," but he didn't just cry. He cried aloud to the Lord. He didn't just cry and feel sorry for himself. He cried to the one who could change things. "And he answered me from his holy hill." Selah, he says, this is true. God hears me and he answers my prayer. He goes on to say in verse 5, "I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me." I want to remind you of some things. You have been through some seasons already. We have, as a church, have been through some things that were difficult already. The church of Jesus has been through some things. So what David says is, hey, you know what? I went to bed and I woke up. God was good at night. He was good in the morning. He has sustained me. It is good for us every once in a while to repeat out loud, to write down the ways that God has sustained us, that God has protected us, that God has been there for us. And so my hope for you this morning is that when you feel like you don't have hope, you sit down and you begin writing all the different ways that the Lord has sustained you. And I'll say this, every once in a while, it's good to just take a nap. It's good to just get some rest. It's good to just turn your mind off and say, I can't fix that right now. I can't deal with that right now. I laid down, I slept, I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. Verse 6, "I will not be afraid." I can't really put myself into the mind of David, but I have to wonder if he wasn't afraid or if he was afraid as he wrote this. Was this him saying, man, I won't give in to it. I'm going to write this because I want this to be true. He says, "I will not be afraid of" what? "Of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around." He says the very thing that most kings are afraid of, the very thing that every ruler is terrified of is happening, but I will not be afraid. He writes it down, he says it, he sings it. He is speaking truth. I won't be afraid. it is important for us to understand where we place our hope and what that hope allows us to do. Listen, I want you to hear this. He is not afraid of the very thing that most people are afraid of. Can I tell you something? There are people all around the world right now who are terrified of death. As Christians, we believe and we understand that death in this life is an entrance into the next life. And so Paul writes, where's your sting, O death? How are you going to control me? These Romans, these Hebrews who are threatening me with death, man, that's gain. I'm going to go to heaven. And so when we have hope, there isn't much to be afraid of when we have eternal hope, when we have a heavenly hope, when we have a hope in Jesus. He goes on to say in verse 7, arise, O Lord, save me. He says, God, you're the one who can save me. I can't do this. Oh my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. He says, God, I'm going to be glory. I'm just going to say it. You are capable of fixing this. You are capable of being my defender. And so he says, arise, Lord, save me, because I can't do it. Here's where most of us need to get to. We need to get to the point where all we have left is God. And David on that hillside has been thrown out of his kingdom. He's running for his life. His army now apparently has given their allegiance to his son. He is not even in the kingdom or the city. He's outside running for his life. All he has left is his relationship with the Lord, and yet he has hope. Some of us have determined that we are hopeless because our rhythm has changed, because we don't feel as secure as we did 6 or 8 weeks ago. We know nothing of the fear that had surrounded this man, and yet he has hope. And then in verse 8, salvation belongs to the Lord. That thing that people said I couldn't have, that there wasn't salvation for me, that belongs to the Lord. That's not theirs to take. That's not mine to give. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah, amen. Think about it. That's truth, he says, and that is what we need to focus on this morning. I'm going to have hope because salvation belongs to the Lord. It does not belong to me. I cannot control it. I am glad this morning that I am not placing my hope in me. I am not enough. This is the gospel, right? We don't have enough strength to fulfill the law, to keep the law, to do what's right. We try to keep the 10 Commandments and we can't go 3 days without telling a lie or having temptation to be covetous. We are people who can't do it on our own. Jesus comes, fulfills the law, and he is the one who saves us. I am incapable of being the object of my hope. I will let myself down. But Jesus is our hope. So this morning, I hope you have a hope that is eternal. I hope you have hope in God, in Jesus, in what his plan is. And I am praying this morning that you are not just somebody else hoping that everything goes away, hoping that we can get back to normal, hoping that this will all just be a dream and we'll wake up from it. David knew the situation around him was painful. It was going to be difficult, but salvation belongs to the Lord. I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what you're dealing with. There are some in our church who have lost their job. There are some in our church who are struggling physically. There are individuals in our church that we're praying for who are going through a difficult season. But I want you to know the good news is you are not your hope. Riches are not your hope. Us just going back to the way things were, that's not our hope, because here's the truth. Even that had holes. It leaked. It never really fulfilled or sustained us. And so for the first time in many of our lives, we have a quiet, restful, maybe not, depending on how many kids you've got in the house with you right now, but a season for reflection. David's not in the kingdom. He's not on the throne. There's nobody playing music. There's nobody bringing him issues. He's by himself on a hillside. And it's in that moment that his hope actually grows. And he writes Psalm chapter 3. My prayer is that in this season, your hope will actually grow, because you will come to realize that you can't be the object of your hope, that salvation doesn't belong to you. You can't save yourself. This is what the gospel means. Jesus came, died on the cross. We celebrate on Easter his resurrection because I couldn't save myself. I'm not good enough. Sin separates us from God. There's no amount of good works that I can do to get to heaven. There's no amount of good deeds that I can do to undo my sinful actions. And so my hope is not in me or in how many good things I do or bad things I don't do. My hope this morning is in Jesus. He's the object of my hope. And my prayer is that if you're watching this stream, Jesus would be the object of your hope. Not just going to church, not just I read my Bible, not just I throw money in the plate, not just I've been baptized, but I want to ask you, is Jesus your hope? When David was going through this crisis, Jehovah God was his hope. He did sustain him. I'll give you some spoilers. Absalom didn't last long. He chased King David, but he was eventually killed. David mourned, he wept, he cried, and that's probably why he is so heartbroken in Psalm chapter 3, because David knows how this is going to play out. He's seen it before. And he realizes that he's about to lose a son. And in the midst of mourning, the emotional turmoil of your own child turning on you, chasing you for your life, David finds hope. So I believe that if David can have hope in a difficult season like that, then we can have hope in a difficult season like today. We can have hope that we won't just get through this, we'll come out stronger. We can have hope that it's possible now maybe our marriages will get stronger. It's possible now maybe we'll be closer to our kids. It's possible now that maybe we'll come out of this with a little more appreciation for what actually matters. It's possible that this crisis could actually be the very thing many of us have needed to come into our lives. Now we're praying for the sick, those who are fighting on the front lines. But for most of us, the main battle we're facing is an inconvenient, lonely season. So I wonder this morning where it is you find your hope.
It's been good to be in church this morning.
Yeah.
I hope you, like me, have been encouraged by singing and the message and even praying together.
Yeah, it's been good to be together this morning, church. If you need to communicate with the church, there are links in the description. Feel free to contact us. Fill out that online Connect card if it's your first time, and we'll make a donation of 10 meals for everybody who does that for the first time. And so we hope you have a great week. We miss you. We love you. We've been praying for you, and we'll see you next Sunday.
Bye. Have a great week.
You are here, you're moving in our midst. I worship you, I worship you. And you are here, you're working in this place. I worship you, I worship you. 'Cause you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. And my God, that is who you are. You waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. And my God, that is who you are.
You are here, touching every heart. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, turning lives around. I worship you, oh, I worship you. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. And my God, that is who you are.
never stopped working. You never stopped working. Even when I can't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. And my God, that is who you are.
Oh, yeah.
You waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. And my God, that is who you are. Yeah, 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 that is who you are. Yes, it is.